Hey guys, welcome to Chef Grace's Place. Today we have Ethan Brown of the Sweaty Penguin. It's a podcast that makes the issues of climate change a lot easier to understand. You might be thinking, why is this on Chef Grace's Place? This is a food podcast. Well, your food is glowing in the climate, so that's why we need to talk about it. How are you, Ethan?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
So, how did you get interested in climate change?
Well, I first learned about it back in maybe high school, and I was really scared and overwhelmed, but I didn't find it interesting. I didn't find it something fun to learn about. And so it was really a challenge for me where I felt like this was a story I needed to tell. I was going to college for film and television, but I was just having so much trouble getting interested. And it really took taking some college classes on it for me to kind of not just develop an interest, but also understand why I might have had a roadblock before. I felt like the issues were being presented in a way that was really overwhelming. And it was also just really politicized. All the politics and science and everything was just so intertwined. And that ultimately led to starting the Sweaty Penguin, where we really take a completely different approach to the issues.
So, I've listened to your podcast before, but for people who haven't, how would you say um, your take is different from the traditional media sense?
So the Sweaty Penguin is a comedy environmental podcast right there. That's comedy and climate change are not always mixed, but the way we approach each issue, each episode focuses on a specific topic, and I'll do a comedy monologue. If you've ever seen like a John Oliver, Hassan Minaj, it's that type of format, obviously very different stylistically, but in terms of just mixing in jokes with actual content. I'll talk about the problem and not just how it affects the environment, but also the economy, health, justice, etc. And then I'll talk about solutions, and there I'll offer up a variety of solutions, discuss the pros and cons of them. So it's not like I'm advocating a specific thing. I just am telling you what's out there. And then we'll interview an expert, and we've had on professors from 11 countries and 5 continents. So it's been really cool to hear their perspectives on these topics too.
That's I really enjoy that part as well, is hearing from the experts. And I'm assuming, I mean that balance of like expert but then also comedian, I think it's a great way to make it a little more digestible for the average news consumer.
Yeah, exactly. I've read many of the research papers from these experts, and they're not writing for a lay audience, so it's by no means their fault, but certainly I can see why folks outside of environmental circles probably aren't going to be consuming that information. So I really take a lot of pride in being able to translate it into something interesting and fun for um, folks who do not have an environmental analysis and policy degree.
So how long have has this podcast been going on?
We launched in April 2020, right as quarantine began. It sort of started as a quarantine passion project with a few friends, and I'm really proud that it's grown into a actual real thing.
Um, do you So, what are some things that since you started in April that you've learned that totally blew your mind?
Well, I think about climate change, what's surprised me, first off, the environment versus economy idea that's very often out there, I've found not to be as accurate as it seems. In fact, I've found the opposite to be true. Um, you can think about all these extreme weather events like hurricanes and wildfires wildfires and the amount of damage they cause, obviously that costs a lot of money to clean up that we could save if we mitigate our emissions. But even just in the present, solar and wind are increasingly some of the cheapest energy sources available. And even just at an individual level, for example, using your car that you have right now to the end of its life would have less emissions than buying the new electric car, because you think about all the inputs that go into building a car that has significant emissions too. So things like that, things like just getting more efficient heating, better light bulb, like these things save you money while helping the climate. And I think if it were framed that way more often, a lot more people would be excited about climate action because it really helps all around. The other thing that has surprised me, which I'm sure we'll get into more here, is about food. We've done a lot of food episodes, and I've found that I think a lot of people's perception, and I think this is also just the way it's been communicated, it seems like environmentalists want you to give up all these different foods and change your diet radically. And again, I haven't found that to be actually supported by evidence. I've found that some foods are really tricky to improve their climate impact, but most, it's a result of just the way we produce it, or more often than that, it's climate change affecting the food more than it's food affecting climate change. So we can get into this more, but things like wine, maple syrup, I mean, we've done lots of different foods where it's climate change that is impacting the food, and we need to figure out how do we adapt to a changing future, not necessarily why is this food negatively impacting the climate. It's more often the other way.
That's an interesting concept. Yeah, let's get into that a little bit more. One of the things that is, I feel like, is being pushed a lot right now is, going meatless. Which I'm opposed to the vegan diet in the way it's presented in mainstream media. There are people that obviously do it right and get it, you know, healthy, but for the most part, people think, oh, I'm gonna substitute my meat with fake meat, right? And it's not the same thing. And a lot of people are going towards these meatless options without even looking how are these things made, what's in them, and also they're not looking at the systems of, um I feel like there's not a lot of studies or mainstream consciousness of regenerative farming, and like how we used to not destroy the topsoil with a bunch of monocultures. Regenerative farming just used to be called farming. Like we didn't have giant fields of corn and soybeans and all this stuff prior to I think it was World War II, right? So what is there any hope in changing that?
That's a good point, that whenever you talk about an issue, you need to look at the alternatives. I think palm oil was a striking example of that for me, where as serious as the issues with palm oil are, which there are very serious issues, but every other substitute vegetable oil would use more land than palm oil uses. And it's not like we don't need these products. So things like that are really important to think through. And I love exploring that nuance and figuring out ways to get through it. In terms of meatless diets, it's obviously going vegan technically has the smallest carbon footprint as it stands now. And I don't see that changing just because it takes more resources to feed and grow an animal than it does to create those plants. But it isn't necessarily like you can have I guess it would be called a Mediterranean diet where you have some meat, some fish, and you'll have almost a comparable impact to a vegan diet. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this all in or all out scenario. You can kind of split the difference. But also, I don't even know that that's the most important thing to do. I think as long as you're not like roasting vegans on Twitter, I don't know why we do that. They're doing us a solid by having that diet, regardless of whatever their reasoning may be. But if we can just uplift people who do make that choice, and then for folks who don't, which includes myself, I love meat. I think that's fine too. I think it's more a question of what do you feel comfortable doing and how can you use that to spur community level change. I think you asked another question about farming in general that has slipped my mind. So sorry if I missed that
Yeah.
one.
So in my research, right, taking a vegan diet, a vegan diet is great if you're also getting all your vegetables from farms that grow vegetables correctly, right? Just like if you got meat from a farm that grew an animal correctly. But if you're contributing to factory farms, like if you're buying all these meatless things, but the main ingredient in them is soy, right? And we just have monocultures of soy, that's also destroying the environment. So it's kind of like you think you're doing a great thing and you're like, oh, and it might, the health part of it is a totally other conversation, but you're just kind of like doing not like it's still having a negative impact. It's not having the impact you think it's having. Let's put it that way, right? When there's other forms of, like for instance, like regenerative farming is, you know what that is, right?
I
Kind
hadn't
of.
heard the term, but I gathered it
Okay,
from
so
your
regenerative
explanation.
farming is when um basically you're looking for like these closed loop systems that all
Mhm.
work together, right? So say I have a farm where like the I have chickens, right? The chickens are eating the little bugs and stuff on the farm, and they're hanging out and they're going on the grass and they're pooping on the grass and they're fertilizing the soil. And after they're done in that little patch, I move them over here and they do this thing to the same part of the soil. Now I have fertilized soil. Now I can plant some green beans or some whatever in that soil, and that poop has fertilized the soil, and and then I have green beans, right?
Mhm.
And then you have the idea of like there's many parts to that, like, and then rotating your crops, like so beans put nitrogen back into the soil, so maybe now I can plant something there that uses a lot of nitrogen. So whereas in the industrial farming complex, it's corn, taking all the nitrogen out and all that stuff. Now we're cutting it down. Now we're going to plant more corn here again. So we're just depleting the natural, the ability to have nutrients in the soil. So we have to put chemical fertilizer on top as a problem, right? We have one type of crop. So the pest that likes that crop knows exactly where to find it because that's all we're planting every season there, right? Huge problem. So then we're putting chemicals to prevent those pests, or we're genetically modifying the corn to be more resistant to that pest, even though those traits in that corn might be harder for us to digest, right? Or the animals we're feeding it to that aren't even supposed to eat that to begin with, right? So, even if we go back to like the Dust Bowl, the Great American Dust Bowl, where we started doing these monocultures back then, right? So as you deplete the nutritional value, the nutrient value in the soil, you're also taking away its ability to hold in water, right? So if you have a lot of dirt that doesn't have a lot of water in it, you get a lot of dust, right? And you also don't get a lot of rain because rain is, evaporation, condensation, precipitation. So that water's got to come from somewhere, right? So, that affects a lot of the climate, not just the food we eat.
Yeah. No, we've certainly gone into all of this stuff that you've been talking about in several contexts, and it's really important. I mean, you use the example of soy. Soy is also one of the main drivers of deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. And you think about all of these things, whether it's that, whether it's monocultures, it's not inherent to the food that we do this. It's just what we're doing. So for someone to say, oh, soy is bad for the environment, we need to change our diets, like, no, we need to produce this better. And I think that's a much more, I mean, again, I'm not going to advocate one way or the other. If you want to cut it out, fine. But to me, it makes a lot more sense to look at the production process and how we can improve that. Because that has, first off, it's a lot easier to do that than to cut things out. But also, it can have impacts across the board, or it can have benefits across the board. It can help the economy, it can help farmers have more stable incomes because very often these crops have very volatile prices. So there's a lot of different aspects here. I do imagine it's a lot more challenging to farm with crop rotations and regenerative farming and all that. But I'm sure if every farmer knew how to do that to some degree, and I know many do, then it could have a lot of benefits. With corn, we did an episode on corn, and then a couple of months later, we did one on chicken. And the nitrogen fertilizer that goes into producing corn is really the leading cause of chickens' climate emissions, because chickens themselves aren't burping or farting methane the way cows do. It's really the fact that to grow a chicken, you need to feed them a lot of corn, and the corn has its emissions. And when you consider the amount of corn that a chicken eats over its lifetime before we eat the chicken, that adds up. So, yeah, it's a very important issue, and absolutely using nitrogen fixing plants. You mentioned green beans. I think legumes can do that. If you rotate those in, that eliminates the need for that type of fertilizer, and that emits nitrous oxide, which is, I think, 300 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So that's a big deal.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Let's back to the comedy. Do you do any stand-up?
Honestly, I have not done stand-up before. I don't know if I ever would. I feel like I want the experience of just bombing a stand-up act, just because like every comedian has that story, and I'm like, wouldn't that be fun? But then I'm like, well, what if I did it and then I was really good at it and then I didn't bomb and then I just had to keep trying to bomb? Like that
I
would
think
be
you win
interesting.
either way then.
Yeah, I think so. I'll just leave it at that and probably never do it, but just live with that fantasy of bombing a show.
I mean, if you want to bomb though. I mean, this seems like you have to do it. Because if you
Yeah,
don't bomb, you win. And if you bomb, you win because you want to bomb.
yeah, exactly. I think it's a win-win either way. No, certainly my comedy experience came from the writing side. I wrote satire for 6 years before doing this podcast. I ran both my high school and college satire publications. And so that was largely what gave me the inspiration to incorporate comedy.
Cool. What did you write about climate? Like, what did you write about in your satires?
So they were both like the school satire publication. So it was largely issues at our in high school at my school and college at Boston University. And I did do a couple things where I would incorporate environmental issues. I remember BU at the time was debating whether or not they wanted to divest from fossil fuels, which would mean they've got their massive endowment that's invested in a whole bunch of different places as they try to make the portfolio grow each year. And they had a chunk of that in fossil fuels, and there were talks about taking it out, which I think there's arguments either way. Certainly, a lot of people argue that it not just contradicts their climate messaging, but it also just isn't economically sensible given the energy market right now with renewable energy becoming so much cheaper. Anyway, I wrote a article, can't remember the exact headline, but I think it was like why BU should stop investing in fossil fuels and start investing in my friend Greg's cantaloupe flavored body spray. And went into all the reasons why that was a better investment. So that was fun. But more often than not, it was just random news that was happening on campus.
That's cool.
It's a random story for you.
I'm trying to think about what cantaloupe body spray smells like.
I don't know, and I really don't want to know.
Oh man, I'm gonna walk into Bath and Body Works next week. It's gonna be like Greg's cantaloupe body spray.
Hey, if BU invested in it, then who knows where that wild ride would go.
So, what kind of what other kinds of food podcasts issues have you covered?
We've done a bunch. I think two that were particularly surprising to me are a great complement for each other. One was vanilla and one was chocolate. So vanilla, give a little overview of each of them. Vanilla is, I think 80% of the world's vanilla is grown in Madagascar. So, and what happens is, first off, vanilla has a very volatile price because it takes a while for a vanilla bean to actually grow and get harvested and ripen to the degree that it needs to. And because of that, when demand for vanilla changes, for example, in 2020, everyone started frantically baking and demand for vanilla like doubled. You can't just suddenly grow more vanilla vines. That takes some time. So that there's this weird price dynamic there. Because of that, there was a point a few years ago where the price of vanilla was greater than the price of silver, which was just astounding to me. So you have this wild price volatility. Add in that Madagascar is now getting hit by about a major cyclone every single year, which is just wiping out vanilla crops. So that makes it even worse. And what happens is, in a year where vanilla prices skyrocket, there's all this money coming into the farmers. A lot of it gets kind of eaten out by middlemen, but for a lot of these middlemen and some of the farmers who are able to reap the benefits of that, they're in these very, very impoverished areas of rural Madagascar. Suddenly, with all this money, they don't even have banks there. They don't have the infrastructure to store that. And there's a lot of crime. So, I mean, think about if you had a giant silver plantation, like there are people who are going to try to steal that. And that's happened. And there have been huge issues with crime, vanilla farmers getting murdered or having to shoot down an intruder. But also, when they come into all this money, they have nowhere to put it. So they'll just kind of hide it and try to get rid of it. So they'll like buy, I've seen examples of them buying sports cars or getting solar panels and satellites for their houses. But even beyond that, there have been myths of vanilla farmers. I think there was a myth of one who taped their money onto a chameleon. There was one who like boiled their money. That like there were all these really bizarre stories about these vanilla farmers trying to handle this influx of money in these ridiculous boom years. And then on the flip side, in the bust years, it's just horrible because the price tanks and they're not getting anything. And you can imagine if there were banks, they could save the money in the boom years, use that in the bust years, but there's just not that infrastructure. So that was a really eye-opening episode, as you can imagine, and I certainly recommend it. Chocolate was different, but also some weird market farmer living situations. For chocolate, first off, chocolate is a majority is grown in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, which are two West African countries. I think around 55% is grown there. And in the global chocolate market, there are 3 companies that are called the cocoa traders. There's a few smaller ones, but it's really the main 3 are Barry Callebaut, Cargill, and Olam. So these traders buy cocoa from warehouses in these 2 countries, who would buy it from middlemen called pisteurs, who would buy it from the farmers. And what happens is when it's just 3 companies buying it, they kind of set their own price because there's not any market competition. So they're paying way less than they should be for the chocolate. Ultimately, that trickles down to the farmers who aren't making nearly as much as they should be. And so they need to figure out a way to make a living, and they will basically turn to desperate measures to grow more cocoa. So how do you do that? Well, you can create more land, which in these countries means deforestation. Cote d'Ivoire has, I think globally, 1% of global forest loss from 1988 to 2008 was due to chocolate globally. If you look in Africa, a quarter of deforestation in Cote d'Ivoire was due to chocolate. And Cote d'Ivoire is the leading deforestation country in all of Africa. Chocolate was the leading cause of deforestation in Cote d'Ivoire. So it's a major issue there. The other thing that happens is get more help to cultivate the chocolate, and that has resulted in a major child labor issue. There are 2 million children working on cocoa plantations, 500,000 in abusive conditions. So, and again, this isn't something you can like blame the farmers for. This is a market situation that resulted out of these this oligopoly with these 3 companies able to set their own prices. And so adding climate change, obviously chocolate is affecting climate change in this way, but climate change is also affecting chocolate just as you change temperatures, and mainly the fact that there would be less precipitation in these regions. Chocolate needs a lot of water to grow. So yeah, both of those were really, really eye-opening in different ways, but you can see in both scenarios how these farmers are really getting screwed by just a economic system that isn't working.
Yeah, it seems like a similar story for a lot of different crops around the world. But it always comes down to some kind of monopoly and some kind of you know, like 3 companies owning like the whole market. But I don't see these people in power giving up their power anytime soon. That's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it really has to, because there are laws that are meant to prevent that. Like it's illegal to price fix, but it's really hard to enforce because it's hard to prove that they're doing that. So ultimately, to me, it's a question of if, I mean, I'm sure people across the political spectrum value different things, but these aren't free markets. So if you were feeling like this is capitalism, like that's not what it's supposed to be.
Yeah,
It's
this isn't
supposed to be,
capitalism.
yeah, it's supposed to be a free and fair competition, and it's not. So
Yeah, even if
whether
a more an issue that hits home, directly, would be the cattle ranchers. Same thing.
Mhm.
Or
Yep.
the meat industry. That to say, America, we love capitalism, but that's not capitalism. You
Yeah,
know?
it's not. Um, I mean, chicken, I remember there were maybe 6 leading poultry companies. I think Tyson themselves have, oh, I have this, sorry, I have a note with a few food statistics. Tyson, Cargill, Cisco, Pilgrim's, Hormel, and Purdue dominate the market, and 96% of uh, chickens raised by farmers are under contract with these companies. And with that, you have these, they basically structure the contract so the farmer assumes all the risk and the corporation assumes all the benefit. So the companies own the chickens, the farmers own all the buildings and equipment and anything that could end up costing money to fix. Um, and the companies also don't buy the chickens back until so we haven't done this episode in a while, so I may get this slightly wrong, but as I remember it, they don't buy the chickens back until the chickens are fully grown. So that means that if any chickens die, which is a possibility when you're doing factory farming like this, especially when there's so much disease running rampant on these farms, you can see how it's really really skewed against the farmers.
Yeah. And the fact that you make this funny, I gotta hand it to you.
That chocolate episode, we read the monologue before we were going to add jokes, and I was like, oh, this is a tough one. Like, that was really sad. The vanilla one was pretty easy to make funny just because, I mean, some elements of that story is a sad story, but also just the idea of farmers running into all this money and what to do with it. The term vanilla, I think vanillionaire was the word to describe them. So yeah, I think I made a Mark Zuckerberg joke there, but with chocolate, that was a challenge, and luckily one of our writers came up with all these amazing chocolate puns that I think really got our minds thinking about jokes after that. But yeah, certainly can be a challenge to write comedy about these things.
It seems like at least for like the chocolate farmers or the vanilla farmers, Bitcoin might be something that would help them out a lot.
Yeah, it could be. I don't know.
Decentralized banking for places with no banks. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I like
Maybe.
to think outside the box with these solutions, and I look at, not that these systems have worked as successfully as they should either, but we see commodities in other parts of the world that are regulated via things like futures contracts, which obviously for that to work, I feel like the farmer needs to be an active participant, and that requires a certain level of education to participate in a global commodity market. But I think that's a promising way to deal with price volatility if done right. And there are many times it has not been done right, but it could be. The other path that has been used, which I'm not as big a fan of, but maple syrup is one case where it's been pretty prominent, is using a global cartel, a legal government cartel. And there's actually a maple syrup cartel in Quebec that controls the majority of the world's maple syrup, and they're able to essentially prevent prices from going haywire by having the International Strategic Reserve of maple syrup up in Canada, and whenever prices are gonna go haywire, they'll release some of the reserve or store some extra syrup and kind of control supply that way. A lot of farmers don't like that. They feel like we should be able to sell our syrup when we make it. But again, if that's the kind of thing you like, that's something that probably could be changed to say, hey, we'll buy the syrup off the farmers and then sell it as we go. So at least the farmers aren't getting screwed. Also, there's been issues of just the cartel being super invasive and controlling, which isn't really supposed to be its purpose. So
Oh, that's what cartels do, though.
yeah, I mean, you say the word cartel, you kind of get a little ego there, but
Just like the avocado cartel in Mexico.
yeah, that I want to learn more about. Certainly, I like half watched a documentary about it, but I do want to do an episode on that at some point. But yeah, certainly there are ways to control price volatility, and there are also ways to try to break up an oligopoly. That's very difficult, but there are certainly solution paths that exist, and it just takes studying them and executing them and being aware that they're not perfect and they need to be improved upon as well, because you can't just start a commodity market and then wipe your hands clean. Like, there's work that goes into making that work.
So what, since you started the podcast, what have you done? What have you changed in your life personally that would affect you, or you think is like helping you combat climate change a little bit on a individual level?
I'll preface it by saying that I think the most effective individual action is action that has a benefit at a larger community level. There's a lot of debate in the environmental world about whether, whether individual action is paramount and necessary and everyone needs to be doing it, or whether it's deflecting from the problem of big corporate emissions and what have you. And I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think both of those are a little extreme. So to me, it's important to use individual action in order to try to spur community level change. So I kind of point out 5 key ways that people can do that. And I hope that I've been able to emulate these myself as well. The first would be find low-hanging fruit. So for some people that might be, I don't really like beef, I'll not eat it that much. That's one thing you could do. But if you like beef, fine, I see no reason why you can't continue eating it. Things like, for me, I'm not a big fashion person, so I don't mind just keeping my clothes and wearing them out until they've shrunk to bits in the laundry. That certainly saves on the emissions from creating the clothing, which are a major source of emissions. So you can look at solutions and consider, would this work for me? And if not, I wouldn't worry too much about it, because to me, it's kind of like dieting. If you take on everything, then you're just going to fall off the wagon. So it's better to kind of find the things that you'll feel successful about and do them, and try to, without being condescending, show the world that you're doing them. Just make it a normal thing, perhaps. The next one would be to do your research. And that's kind of like I talked about before with the electric car thing. There's other examples of that too. You want to be sure that your solution is actually a solution. Even things like recycling your clothing. A lot of recycled clothing just gets, or not recycling, but donating clothing. A lot of donated clothes get shipped to Africa and burned up because they receive it by the ton and they have nothing to do with it. So yeah, if you want to donate clothing, make sure it has a recipient as best you can. So things like that, like you need to not just do the trendy thing, but actually figure out if the solution will be effective. And I think that's where listening to the Sweaty Penguin is a great way to get that information. Third would be uplift others who are doing good things. That goes back to kind of that like vegan bashing, or for me, I think it would be easy to be like, hey, that your pajamas have a bunch of holes in them. Why are you wearing, like, maybe I shouldn't do that. But certainly trying to encourage people who are doing good things rather than demeaning it. And then 4 would be find ways to use your voice. For me, that was creating this podcast. I know a lot of people think of just volunteering or being an activist or something, and that's great. For me, that wasn't the right path. I went to a protest and just felt claustrophobic and horrible, and it was really noisy. But also for me, like, you can see I love this nuance, and so there's nothing I could put on a sign that would emulate how I feel about these issues. So I felt more at home just being the source of information, because I really don't care what solution we take. I just want to do something. And I'd rather present that to other people and try to initiate conversations for them to think about what solutions they would like. And I feel like that's a step in the right direction. So you can take a number of approaches. It could be writing, it could be doing something at your job that would help. A lot of things you could do. And then lastly, talk to someone you disagree with. And I think this is a really important one. It's one I've really actively tried to do. I feel like a large part of why we struggle to make progress on the environment is that in an American context, we have liberals and conservatives who just hate each other and don't want to talk. And that leads us to not even be on the same page about what the problems are. And I feel like if we agreed on what the problems are, even if we disagreed on solutions, we would make progress. And to get there, we would first need to just be able to have a conversation. I don't even think you need to be friends especially if you genuinely feel like someone has fundamental moral differences. Like, of course, you don't have to be friends with them, but even just like talking about sports or movies, like, I feel like it makes a positive impact to just be able to be in the same conversation. I think that kind of thing can really make a difference. So those are kind of my 5 things, which I think all can spur community level action from an individual level. And that's kind of how I'm trying to play my role as well.
I think those things are great. And I would also, the last one I really like, talk to someone you disagree with. And just a little point I'd like to add to that, because I feel like, since I was a kid, I was part of the generation that I probably didn't have a cell phone until maybe middle school. But even then, like, that wasn't like, it was just something that like you'd call your mom with, and because you couldn't text, you had to press the button like a million times. Everyone wasn't glued to their phone. You couldn't just look up. You didn't have the internet on your phone yet either, so you couldn't just like Google it and see who was right. So debating was like an art form, like you had to get good at it. It was like a sport. They had debate teams. But one of the things I think people should always try to do when they're disagreeing with someone is to remember to argue their point. Don't argue the person. You know what I mean? So many times where I overhear people arguing their points and stuff, and then they're going, "What are you, stupid? What do you think about? You think this about this?" And instead, you should be like, "I think this because this and this and this are the things that I found that support my opinion. What did you find?" You know what I mean? And I think it would be a lot more civil that way.
Yeah, there's a wonderful technique from Dale Carnegie, if anyone is familiar with him, called Disagreeing Agreeably, where basically you want to first restate what the other person said in your own words, show that you understood and absorbed what they said. And if you didn't understand it, like ask them first, but restate what they said, then provide all the evidence for your point, and then make your point at the end. And I find that when doing that, it comes off as way less argumentative because, oh, and the other point within that, avoid words like but, however, although, like just take them out, just replace it with and it feels weird, but it totally takes away a lot of the confrontation that happens in debate. And so I've kind of just, having practiced a little bit, I've kind of just grown accustomed to doing that if I'm disagreeing with someone, especially if I'm talking about the environment, since I'm very comfortable talking about the issues, so I can focus a little more on my rhetoric. But yeah, that seems to be a strategy that works well. But really, it's not even just that. I think I always aim to learn something in those conversations more than anything else. And I have been swayed many a time by friends who are liberal and friends who are conservative, and I greatly appreciate it because I learn more from them. I learn maybe how to communicate with them better the next time. They know they can trust me as a person who will completely listen to them and hear them out, and I'm comfortable changing my mind. So I know all of that isn't necessarily easy to do, but it certainly makes a difference in those conversations.
That's very well said. So do you have anything you want to add?
Uh, I think we've covered a lot. I really appreciate you having me on the show. And if I can just give the obligatory plug,
Of course.
you can find the Sweaty Penguin on any podcast platform you like, Apple, Spotify, Google, etc. You can also find us at thesweatypenguin.com. We're also partners with PBS's National Multi-Platform Climate Initiative, Peril and Promise. So you can find us there at pbs.org/peril and promise. And social media, we're on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, all that good stuff. And lastly, if you want to support the show, I seriously recommend checking out our Patreon at patreon.com/thesweatypenguin. We have merch, we have bonus content, we have a whole bunch of cool stuff, and that's a really important thing to keep us going and help us pay the bills. So check that out as well.
Right. Thank you so much. All the links for this we'll put in the description as well. So it's easy
Perfect.
for
Thank you
people to
so
click
much.
on.